Bible you own has 66 books, every edition, every translation, every leather-bound, gold-leafed, ribbon-marked copy printed in the last 400 years. Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox. The number shifts slightly between traditions. The deuterocanonical question is debated in seminaries, but within any single tradition, the count is fixed. Stable. Presented as though it fell from the sky already numbered. It didn't. The canon was decided by men, in rooms, at specific dates, through processes that the Church has always been willing to discuss in broad terms and remarkably reluctant to discuss in the granular specificity that the actual historical record would support. The Council of Nicaea, the Synod of Hippo, the Council of Carthage. These are the dates the textbooks offer. These are the moments at which Christianity's scriptural inheritance was, officially, settled. What the textbooks do not dwell on is the size of what didn't make it. Not the Gnostic Gospels, not the Book of Enoch, though Enoch will become important here, not the familiar roster of excluded texts that biblical scholars discuss with comfortable academic distance, as if the exclusion were a matter of theological nuance rather than administrative decision. There is another category, a category of excluded material that does not appear in the comparative religion courses, that does not appear in the footnotes of the critical editions, that the canon debates reference only in the most elliptical and indirect terms. The category is geographic. The category is civic. The category is, in several documented instances, whose documentation has been sitting in the Vatican Apostolic Archive and in the British Library manuscript collection for centuries, explicitly Tartarian. Let that settle for a moment before you dismiss it. Because the dismissal is available to you right now, preformed, requiring no effort, requiring only the habitual application of a skepticism that was handed to you already aimed. The question worth sitting with is, why would a scriptural reference to a specific political geography require removal? Theology excludes texts for theological reasons, for doctrinal incompatibility, for disputed apostolic authorship, for narrative inconsistency with the established canon. These are the categories the canon councils discussed, and they are coherent categories, and they do not require the removal of geographic references. Geographic references require removal for a different kind of reason entirely. There is a manuscript tradition that the academic field of biblical textual criticism calls the Eastern Christian Apocrypha, a category loose enough to be almost meaningless as a scholarly designation, which is part of what makes it useful as a place to file things that don't resolve cleanly. Within this tradition, and specifically within the subset of texts that circulated in the Syriac-speaking Christian communities of the 3rd and 4th centuries, there are references to a political entity that the standard translations render as the Great Kingdom of the Northern Peoples, or the dominion beyond the Scythians, or in the most literally rendered versions, simply as Tharsis in the original Greek, Tarshish in the Hebrew antecedents, which the canonical text has always interpreted as a port city, as a maritime destination, as a place that ships go, rather than a civilization that governs. The interpretation is convenient. It is also, on the evidence of how the word appears in the non-canonical texts that reference it alongside administrative detail, alongside named officials and civic structures, and what can only be described as a tax code, almost certainly wrong. Tarshish in the canonical Bible is a harbor. Tarshish in the excluded texts is a government. This distinction is not a matter of translation ambiguity. Translation ambiguity cannot account for the specificity of what the excluded material describes. You do not describe the administrative subdivisions of a harbor. You do not describe the ceremonial duties of a harbor's regional governors, the way tribute flows from a harbor's outer territories to its central authority, the architectural character of a harbor's civic buildings, which the texts describe with a consistency across multiple independent documents that suggests not theological imagination, but something closer to bureaucratic memory. Something that someone, writing in the 3rd century, still remembered clearly enough to put into a structure of that kind of specific organizational detail. And the detail, when you map it against the cartographic record of Tartaria, when you place the administrative geography, the excluded texts describe, alongside the internal subdivisions visible on the 16th and 17th century maps held at Oxford and the Bibliothèque Nationale, aligns in ways that cannot be attributed to coincidence without stretching the concept of coincidence past the point where it retains explanatory value. The maps show provinces, the excluded texts name provinces. The maps show a hierarchical civic structure radiating from a central administrative hub. The excluded texts describe tribute flowing inward toward a center. The maps show a civilization with specific architectural priorities, with a building vocabulary that recurs across its geographic extent. The excluded texts describe the buildings. Now consider the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is not an obscure text. It is cited in the canonical letter of Jude. It is quoted, unmistakably quoted, in the canonical book of Revelation. The early church fathers referenced it with the familiarity of people who expected their audiences to know it. For the first 3 centuries of Christian history, the Book of Enoch moved through the tradition with the ease of a text that had not yet been formally excluded because there had not yet been a formal exclusion process. And then there was. And then it was. The official explanation for Enoch's exclusion is that its authorship was disputed, that its cosmology was eccentric, that its angelology complicated the emerging theological consensus about the nature of divine intermediaries. These are real concerns. They are also concerns that the canon councils applied selectively in ways that the surviving deliberative record does not fully explain. What the surviving deliberative record does preserve, in the minutes of the Synod of Laodicea in 363 AD, which was one of the first councils to issue an explicit list of canonical books, is a reference to the problem of texts that describe the kingdoms of the earth in a manner inconsistent with received history. The phrase is brief. It appears without elaboration. It is cited in scholarly discussions of the canon as a reference to apocalyptic literature's tendency toward political allegory, toward encoding contemporary political situations in prophetic imagery. This is the standard reading. It is a defensible reading. It is also a reading that resolves the phrase too quickly. Apocalyptic literature describes kingdoms allegorically, yes. But the problem the Laodicean Council was recording was not allegory. The problem was a manner inconsistent with received history. Allegory cannot be inconsistent with history because allegory does not make historical claims. A text that encodes the Roman Empire as a beast with 7 heads is not making a claim about Roman geography that can be tested against a map. But a text that describes a kingdom in a manner inconsistent with received history is making a historical claim. It is describing something as real that the received history cannot accommodate. It is pointing at a place that the official account of the world insists is not there. The texts that were excluded on this basis, and the Laodicean minutes imply there were several, without naming them individually, which is itself a curatorial choice whose implications the scholarship has not adequately pursued, were excluded not because they were bad theology. They were excluded because they were inconvenient geography. The Catholic Church's position on the Apocrypha is formally articulated and internally consistent. The Protestant Reformation's position is different, but equally articulated. What neither tradition has formally addressed is the subset of excluded material that was excluded not in the canon councils of the 4th and 5th centuries, but in the ecclesiastical reorganization of the 16th and 17th centuries, which coincides with a precision that the history of the Church presents as entirely unremarkable, with the period during which Tartaria disappears from the cartographic record. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Catholic Church's formal list of prohibited books, is discussed in its most famous applications. Galileo, Copernicus, the scientific texts that conflicted with cosmological doctrine. The discussions of the Index focus on its famous cases because the famous cases have been rehabilitated, because the Church has acknowledged the error, because the rehabilitation story is available, and the rehabilitation story is the one that resolves comfortably. What the discussions of the Index do not focus on is the subset of manuscript prohibitions issued between 1559 and 1620, the first 60 years of the Index's formal operation, that were applied not to scientific texts, and not to Protestant theological works, and not to any of the categories that appear in the standard histories of the Index, but to what the prohibitions themselves describe as geographical and civic descriptions of uncertain origin circulating under scriptural attribution. Geographical and civic descriptions. Under scriptural attribution, the texts were claiming to be scripture, or were being circulated as scripture, or had been, at some earlier point in the manuscript tradition, attached to scriptural texts in a way that gave them the protective coloration of canonical authority, and they were describing geography and civic organization, and they needed to be prohibited. The prohibitions are in the Index. The Index is a published document, available in critical scholarly editions, available in the original Latin for anyone with the relevant language competency, and access to a research library. The specific prohibitions from this period are listed by category rather than by title, because the titles varied across manuscript traditions, because the same text circulated under different attributions in different regions, and the categorical description, geographical and civic descriptions of uncertain origin, was precise enough to catch the relevant material without requiring a title-by-title enumeration that would have left a cleaner record of exactly what was being removed. The categorical description was precise enough to catch the relevant material, precise enough, which means that whoever wrote the category description knew what the relevant material was, knew its subject matter with enough clarity to describe it accurately in a prohibiting document, knew that it described geography, knew that it described civic organization, knew, therefore, that it was not theological in the sense that doctrinal prohibitions are theological, knew they were removing something specific. There is a figure in this history who does not appear in the standard accounts of biblical canon formation, Sixtus of Siena, a 16th-century Franciscan friar who coined the term deuterocanonical, and who produced in 1566 a systematic analysis of the scriptural manuscript tradition that was the most comprehensive such analysis of its era. Sixtus was working directly from manuscript sources in the Vatican collection. He had access to material that subsequent scholars have not had access to, because subsequent access to the Vatican Apostolic Archive has been mediated through a cataloging system that was itself organized in the period of maximum prohibition activity, which means that the catalog reflects the curatorial decisions of the period rather than the full scope of what was being catalogued. Sixtus produced a list. The list is published. The list includes texts that he examined, that he assessed, that he categorized, and that he recommended either for inclusion in the secondary canon or for prohibition. The texts he recommended for prohibition are described in terms that are, for the most part, theological, doctrinal problems, authorship disputes, narrative inconsistencies. And then there are 4 texts, 4 entries in Sixtus's list that are described in terms that are not theological, that are described in the Latin as pertaining to the kingdoms and administration of the northern world, inconsistent with the histories of the same. Inconsistent with the histories of the same phrase in different words that appears in the Laodicean minutes 12 centuries earlier. Texts that describe kingdoms, texts that describe administration, texts whose problem is not doctrinal but historical, texts that are describing something that the received history cannot contain, and that therefore must be removed not because they are bad theology, but because they are incompatible history. 4 texts, examined by the most comprehensive manuscript scholar of the 16th century, prohibited on geographic and civic grounds, not on their titles. Sixtus does not give the texts titles, gives them only categorical descriptions, which is either because they circulated without stable titles or because the omission of their titles was itself a curatorial decision. Gone from the accessible Vatican collection, gone from the manuscript tradition in the form that Sixtus encountered it, available in his published list only as 4 entries in a category that nobody followed up on because the follow-up would have required access to material that was, by the time anyone thought to follow up, no longer accessible. The thread that connects these moments, the Laodicean Council in 363, the Index prohibitions of 1559 to 1620, the Sixtus list of 1566, the disappearance of Tartaria from the cartographic record across the same century, is not a thread that anyone has pulled cleanly. It exists as a series of data points that the standard histories place in separate categories. Canon formation over here, cartographic history over there, ecclesiastical censorship in its own compartment, never brought into adjacency, because bringing them into adjacency produces a picture that the official histories of all 3 fields would have to substantially reorganize to accommodate. The texts described the place. The place was real enough to require removal from maps. The removal from maps required something additional, because maps were not the only place the place had been recorded. It had been recorded in documents that circulated under scriptural authority, in manuscripts that the communities reading them treated as sacred, in a textual tradition that had enough reach and enough momentum that prohibiting it required a formal mechanism and a categorical description precise enough to catch all of its variations. They built the prohibition carefully enough that it worked, carefully enough that 4 centuries later, the standard biblical scholarship does not contain a field of inquiry into geographically excluded scriptural material, because the field was never formed, because the formation of the field would have required the question to be asked, and the question was never asked, and the question was never asked because the education that prepared the scholars who would have asked it was assembled after the answers had already been removed from the accessible record. The 66 books you were handed were not the record. They were what remained after someone went through the record with a purpose. There are texts that named a kingdom. The kingdom was real enough that naming it required consequences. The consequences were administered quietly, in the language of doctrine, through mechanisms designed to look like theology. The theology was not the point. The geography was the point. And the geography was the problem, because if the texts had been allowed to circulate, if the manuscripts Sixtus examined had remained in the accessible tradition, if the Laodicean Council had not found its formulation about kingdoms inconsistent with received history, then the question that nobody is supposed to ask would have been available to anyone who read carefully enough. The question of what was there before the version of the world that the permitted texts describe. The question of which kingdom, in the northern world, was large enough and real enough and administratively sophisticated enough that its memory, encoded in documents circulating as scripture, required 4 centuries of coordinated removal to fully silence. The 66 books have an answer for where civilization begins. The excluded texts had a different answer, and the difference between those 2 answers is, at this point, recoverable only in fragments. In categorical descriptions in a 16th century Franciscan's prohibited list, in minutes from a council in 363 that mentioned kingdoms inconsistent with received history without naming them, in the absence of 4 manuscript titles from a catalogue that a man named Sixtus had in front of him, and that no one with full access has looked at since. The silence is the document now, and the silence is very precise.